Josephine Vance was 39 years old the afternoon her husband of 12 years sat across a conference table, uncapped a pen, and signed the divorce papers with a smile she recognized as relief. To the people who had known her through the marriage, the neighbors on their street in Richmond, the couples they had shared dinners with, the women from the garden club that had been her mother-in-law's domain and had absorbed Josephine by extension, she was Modest Joe. The one with the quiet job at the nonprofit. The one who drove a sensible car and wore sensible things and made a sensible salary and had, as far as anyone in that circle understood, very little beyond what was visible. Kenneth Vance had married her at 30 and had spent 12 years being mildly proud of her in the way a man is proud of a piece of furniture that suits the room. He had a commercial real estate firm, he had opinions about wine, he had a precise and detailed understanding of what everyone around him was worth, financially and socially, which was the particular skill set of a man who sorted the world that way. He had never sorted Josephine correctly. What he did not know, what her mother had asked her to keep quiet when it became clear what Kenneth was, and what Josephine had honored out of a combination of her mother's wisdom and her own preference for not performing her life in front of people who hadn't earned the viewing, was that Josephine's maternal grandmother had built one of the most quietly significant textile manufacturing legacies in the mid-Atlantic, and that the trust she had established before her death 15 years ago had been accumulating, compounding, and waiting in Josephine's name for the terms of its release to be met. The terms had been met on Josephine's 39th birthday, 4 months before the divorce filing. The trust value at the time of her birthday distribution was $500 million. Kenneth had signed the papers smiling. He had signed away any claim he might have pursued if he had known what he was signing away, because the trust was hers, documented as premarital inheritance, structured by a team of attorneys who had spent 15 years making certain it was unreachable. What happened next was not a revenge. It was simply the remainder of her life, conducted at full scale. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The morning light in the house on Grove Avenue came in from the east through windows she had chosen herself when they renovated 6 years ago, and it arrived at a particular angle in the autumn that had always made the kitchen feel like the beginning of something rather than the middle. She made her tea at 5:30 and sat at the table by the window and did what she had done every morning of her adult life, she thought before she moved. Her grandmother had been a woman of the same habit. Vivian Cross had built her textile company in the 1960s, starting with 2 industrial looms in a leased warehouse in Petersburg, Virginia, and had run it for 40 years with the patience and exactness of someone who understood that the work was the answer to every question, and that the people who tried to rush the work were the ones who discovered, too late, that they had skipped something load-bearing. She had passed when Josephine was 24, leaving behind a company she had already sold at appropriate valuation, a family, and a trust she had structured with the same care she had brought to every bolt of fabric she had ever inspected before it left her floor. Her grandmother had told Josephine once, when she was perhaps 11, that the world would spend a great deal of effort trying to show her what she was worth. She should not, under any circumstances, let it. Josephine had carried that forward. She had carried it through her degree in art history, which people assumed was decorative. She had carried it through her work at the nonprofit, which administered arts education grants across the Richmond metro, and which she had run as executive director for 7 years. Work that was quiet and unglamorous and that had placed $22 million in program funding into communities over the course of her tenure. She had carried it through 12 years of a marriage that had asked her, in 100 small ways, to be less than what she was, and she had declined each of those requests so quietly that Kenneth had never registered the refusals. She had met Kenneth Vance at a charity gala in 2012. He was prosperous and easy in social rooms and had asked her to dance with a confidence she found, at 31, more appealing than she would have found it 5 years later. He had pursued her attentively and married her within the year and been, for the first 3 years of the marriage, a version of the man she had assessed when she accepted him. The version that emerged in the years after was not dramatically different. It was a smaller version. A man who reduced things to make them manageable, including her. She had told her mother about the trust the year before the wedding. Her mother had said, quietly and without drama, that she thought it would be wise to keep that between them. Josephine had asked why. Her mother had looked at Kenneth for a moment and said only, "Let him show you who he is first." She had honored her mother's counsel for 12 years. The moment she understood the marriage was finished came not from a dramatic event, but from a Tuesday in February when Kenneth had looked at her across the dinner table and said, in the tone of a man making a reasonable observation, that she might consider whether her work at the nonprofit was the best use of her time, given that his firm was doing well and they didn't need the income, which she had understood to mean that her work was not serious because the salary it produced was not serious, and that a serious woman in her position would redirect herself toward the auxiliary role a serious woman in her position was designed to occupy. She had said, "I'll think about it," and had thought about it for 6 weeks and then called her attorney. Her attorney was a woman named Margaret Osai, who had offices on East Broad Street in Richmond and who had been retained by the family trust's administrative team before Josephine's marriage as the individual attorney who would manage her personal legal affairs. Margaret knew everything about the trust. She had been waiting, with the particular patience of a woman who understood the legal landscape perfectly, for this call for several years. She picked up on the second ring. "I'm ready," Josephine said. Margaret said, "I'll need 2 weeks to prepare the filing. Come in Thursday." The trust documentation was immaculate. It had been assembled by the firm that managed the Cross family estate for 15 years, and it established, without any arguable ambiguity, that the trust was inherited wealth, premarital in origin by 39 years, never commingled with marital assets, maintained in a separate fiduciary structure throughout the marriage. Kenneth's name did not appear in any trust document in any capacity. He had never been a beneficiary, a trustee, a named party, or an acknowledged proximity holder of any kind. He had simply never known it existed. She had also, on the advice of her mother and of Margaret, maintained her personal finances in clean separation throughout the marriage. She earned her salary. She spent from it. She contributed to household expenses from a joint account that received a fixed monthly transfer from her personal account. Her personal account had never received a trust distribution because the trust had not yet distributed. The joint account had never seen a dollar that originated outside her salary. When the trust distributed on her 39th birthday in August, the funds moved into a fiduciary account managed by Margaret's office and the estate firm. They had not touched the joint account. They had not touched anything Kenneth had access to. They had simply arrived in the place they had always been going without announcement. She filed for divorce in October, 2 months after her birthday. Kenneth had been surprised, which told her something. A man who had been paying attention to his wife would not have been surprised. He had hired an attorney. His attorney was a competent man named Roland, who specialized in high-asset divorce and who had, Margaret later told her, made the initial inquiry about trust assets in the first week. Margaret had responded to that inquiry with a 40-page brief that outlined the premarital character of the trust, the 15-year documentation history, and the controlling Virginia law on inherited wealth in divorce proceedings. Roland had been quiet for a week after receiving it. Kenneth had called Josephine directly 3 days after Roland received the brief. She had let him speak. He said he felt they should discuss things personally, that the attorneys were making this more complicated than it needed to be, that he thought they could come to a reasonable arrangement between themselves. She had listened to all of it. Then she said, "Margaret will be in touch," and ended the call. She moved with the same deliberate calm that had always defined her. Her Aunt Cecile, her mother's older sister, came to stay for a week in November, the month before the final proceedings. Cecile was 72 and had known Josephine's grandmother personally and had grown up watching Vivian Cross build something from a leased warehouse and 2 looms. And she was the kind of woman whose presence reorganized a room without her doing anything deliberate to cause it. She sat with Josephine at the kitchen table on the second evening and looked at her directly and said, "Your grandmother always said you had the most of her in you, out of all of them." Josephine had never heard this. She sat with it. She meant the patience, Cecile said, and the willingness to let things arrive in their own time. She picked up her tea. She waited 40 years to sell that company. People told her to sell it in year 15 when the offer was good. She said the offer wasn't right yet. She paused. She was correct. Josephine thought about the trust sitting in its fiduciary account for 39 years, compounding quietly, waiting for its terms to be met. Real power, her grandmother had always understood, operated in quiet rooms. The conference table at Roland's offices on a Thursday in December had a view of the James River, which Josephine noted and did not find meaningful in either direction. She was there with Margaret. Kenneth was there with Roland. The papers had been reviewed. The terms had been negotiated over 6 weeks of correspondence between the 2 attorneys and had arrived at a settlement that reflected the legal reality. The trust was not a marital asset. The household assets were modest. Kenneth retained the house in Grove Avenue at his insistence and would manage the buyout of Josephine's equity interest on a schedule they had agreed to, and the marriage would be dissolved. Kenneth had received, through Roland, the full trust documentation 3 weeks before this meeting. He had had time to understand what he was looking at. He had had time to understand that the woman across the table from him had been the heir to $500 million for 39 years, had been the distributable heir for 4 months, and that not a dollar of it was reachable and never had been. He picked up the pen. He signed. She watched him do it. She watched the smile that crossed his face, the smile of a man completing a transaction he believed he had navigated successfully, a man who had not yet fully arrived at the arithmetic of what he had spent 12 years beside without seeing. The smile would adjust over time. She did not need to be present for that adjustment. She signed where indicated. She thanked Roland for his professionalism. She walked out of the building with Margaret beside her and stood on the sidewalk in the December air for a moment. "Well," Margaret said. "Yes," Josephine said. That was all that needed to be said between them. 14 months later, Josephine was in the offices of the Vivian Cross Foundation on West Broad Street, in the middle of a Thursday morning that had the quality of most Thursdays she had known, full and purposeful, and organized in the way of work that had been carefully designed. The foundation had been established within 6 months of the trust distribution, and it carried her grandmother's name because the money carried her grandmother's work, and Josephine had understood from the first day of the distribution that the question was not what she would have, but what she would build. The foundation administered arts education and economic empowerment grants. It operated in 5 cities. In its first year, it had placed $18 million in program funding. That number would be larger in year 2. Josephine had brought her nonprofit skills and her 14 years of development experience and the quiet operational competence that her salary had never fully reflected, and she had built the foundation the way her grandmother had built the company, from the floor up, with patience, without announcing the work before it was ready to speak for itself. She had moved into a house in the Fan District, a row house she had purchased herself, and was renovating slowly, one room at a time, making the decisions about the tile and the windows and the light herself. Because those decisions mattered to her, and she was, finally, in a position where she was making all of her decisions in her own name. Kenneth, she understood through the ordinary current of Richmond's professional world, had sold the house on Grove Avenue and moved into a condominium and was running his firm with the same energy he had always brought to it. He had told someone in their former social circle that the divorce had been mutual, which she received without feeling the need to correct it. The truth was in the public record. Anyone who needed to know it could find it. There was a man named Lawrence in her life, a historian at the university who had come to the foundation's inaugural grand ceremony as a guest of one of the awardees, and who had introduced himself by asking what the foundation's theory of change was, which was the most interesting question anyone had asked her at a social event and longer than she could easily measure. He was thoughtful and unhurried, and had come into her life the way things came into her life when she was not rushing them, quietly with evidence behind them at their own pace. He had met Cecile in the spring. Cecile had said, on the drive home, that he had good questions and the patience to hear the answers. That was Cecile's highest designation. It was enough. Josephine stood at the window of the foundation offices on a Thursday morning and looked at the street below and thought about her grandmother at the looms in the leased warehouse in 1962. Patient and exact, working without announcement towards something she already knew would hold. She thought about the trust accumulating for 39 years in a fiduciary account while the world arranged itself around her, while she grew and married and worked and waited. Some things her grandmother had understood were worth building slowly. The work was always the answer to every question. She turned from the window and went back to her desk. She had everything worth keeping. She had built the rest. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.